My father died on a Tuesday in March. And I found out through a voicemail. Not a call. A voicemail. Because I was in the middle of a client meeting and couldn't pick up. By the time I listened to it in the parking garage, sitting on the cold concrete floor of level 3, the message had already been sitting on my phone for 2 hours. That's the kind of distance my father and I had built between us over the last few years. Not hostile, just wide. His name was Thomas Calloway. He was 61 years old. A craftsman who could restore a 100-year-old cabinet to better than original. A man who made things last. He died of a stroke on a Tuesday morning. Alone in his house in Asheville. And the neighbor found him when the mail started piling up. I flew in from Atlanta the next day. I handled everything the way he would have wanted, practical. No drama. No falling apart in public. I stood at his graveside in the same way he'd stood at everything in his life. Quietly. Like the hard part was just a job that needed doing. 2 weeks later, his attorney called and asked me to come in. Helen Park had been my father's lawyer for over a decade. Her office was in a narrow building downtown, sandwiched between a coffee shop and a frame gallery. She met me at the door herself and shook my hand with both of hers. I hadn't been here before. My father had never mentioned her to me by name. He mentioned very few things by name. She poured coffee without asking and set the cup in front of me before opening a thin manila folder on her desk. Your father's estate is straightforward, she said. The house in Ridgecrest. His tools and equipment. A modest savings account. All left to you. But there's one more thing. She paused and opened the folder to a tabbed page near the back. He also owns a property outside of town. It's called the Millward Building. 12 acres off Route 9. About 40 minutes from here. He purchased it 8 years ago. The deed transfers to you effective today. I stared at her. He never told me he had property out there. She looked at me carefully over her reading glasses. I know. He was very specific about that. She reached into the folder and produced a small craft envelope with my name written on the front in my father's handwriting. He left this to be given to you only after his death. He also asked me to give you this. She set a key on the desk between us. Plein bras. No label. I picked up the envelope first. Inside was a single folded page. Maya. It read, if you're reading this, I'm sorry I didn't say it in person. The Millward Building is yours. I've been working on something there for the last 3 years that I couldn't explain while I was alive. Not without putting you in the middle of it before it was ready. Go there before you make any decisions. Everything you need is in the back room. The combination to the lock is your mother's birthday plus the year we bought our first house. Don't trust Reed with anything until you've read what's inside. I mean that. I sat with the letter for a long moment. Outside, the coffee shop music seeped through the wall. Something acoustic and unhurried. Reed Holloway had been my father's business partner for 15 years. He had been at the funeral. He had hugged me at the graveside and told me my father was the finest man he'd ever known. He had texted me twice since then asking if I needed help going through my father's affairs. What do you know about Reed Holloway? I asked Helen. She folded her hands on the desk. Your father mentioned him occasionally. He said he'd been his partner before he wasn't. I asked him once to clarify, and he said he preferred not to. I looked at the key. Before he wasn't. She slid a business card across the desk. If you need anything, call me directly. Day or night. Your father specifically asked me to say that to you. I drove out to the Millward Building the next morning. The road off Route 9 was unpaved for the last half mile, winding through bare March trees before opening onto a gravel lot. The building itself was larger than I'd expected. An old converted mill. 2 stories of weathered brick with high industrial windows and a new metal roof that stood out against the old stone foundation like a patch on a quilt. Someone had been maintaining it. The gutters were clean. The gravel recently raked. An emotion light above the door was still functioning. A man was waiting near the side entrance. He was maybe 55. Heavy-set in a canvas work coat, with the kind of face that looks like it spent most of its life outdoors. He raised a hand when he saw me pull up. "You must be Maya," he said. "I'm Cal Briggs. Your father hired me to look after the place. He told me you'd be coming." I shook his hand. "How long have you been out here?" "3 years. He said. "Since your father bought the equipment." "What equipment?" He glanced at the building, then back at me. "He said you'd need to see it yourself." He was particular about the order of things. Inside smelled like sawdust and machine oil and something older underneath. Stone, maybe. Or the particular cold of a building that's held its breath for a long time. The main floor was a large open workspace. Restored furniture filled one wall, tagged and wrapped in moving blankets. A long workbench ran the length of another wall. Tools hung in neat rows above it. Everything was organized the way my father organized everything, by function, by frequency of use, by some logic that was entirely his. At the back of the room was a door, heavy wood with a newer deadbolt installed above the original lock. The brass key fit the deadbolt. My mother's birthday and the year we moved into the house on Ferndale opened the lower combination lock. The door swung inward onto a narrow staircase going down. The basement was dry and cool, lit by overhead fluorescence on a motion sensor. One wall held a filing cabinet, a long work table, and a corkboard covered in printed documents, photographs, and handwritten annotations in my father's small type printing. The opposite wall held 3 plastic storage totes labeled by year. On the work table sat a laptop, a portable hard drive, and a second envelope addressed to me in the same handwriting as the first. I stood in the doorway for a moment, taking it in. Cal waited at the top of the stairs, giving me the space my father must have told him to give me. The second letter was longer. "Maya," it said. "What you're looking at is 3 years of documentation. Reed and I dissolved our partnership in 2021. Officially, what he doesn't know is that I spent the 2 years before that quietly pulling together everything I could find. He's been running a side arrangement with a development group out of Charlotte called Westridge Partners. They've been acquiring land on this side of the county using appraisals that don't hold up to scrutiny, then flipping the parcels to municipal buyers at inflated prices. Reed introduced me to Westridge as a consultant. I didn't know what they were using my name for until I saw one of the appraisal filings with my signature on it. I never signed those documents. He forged them. I pulled my name from the partnership as soon as I found out. He threatened me. He said I was too old to start over and too involved to walk away clean. I said nothing and started documenting. The hard drive password is the name of our dog plus the street we grew up on. Everything is organized and labeled. Helen has a copy of the summary. When you're ready, call her. If Reed reaches out to you before you've read all of this, don't engage. He's good at sounding reasonable. He's had a lot of practice. I sat on the bottom stair and read the letter twice. My father had been protecting me. He'd built an entire evidentiary case in a basement, alone, for 3 years. And he hadn't said a word because he didn't want me anywhere near it until it was ready. Until he was gone. I didn't know whether to feel grateful or wrecked by that. So I felt both at once and kept moving. I opened the hard drive. The password worked on the first try. The folder was labeled simply Record. Inside were subfolders by year and category. Forged signatures. Banktransfers. Email chains. Appraisal documents with side-by-side comparisons showing the alterations. One subfolder held a scanned letter from Reed to Westridge Partners, written 18 months before the partnership dissolved, promising them continued access to my father's credentials and professional reputation in exchange for a 10% referral fee on each transaction. The amounts involved ran into the hundreds of thousands. Cal came down the stairs after a while and set a thermos of coffee on the work table without being asked. "He told me you'd need this," he said simply. "He told you a lot of things." He was a careful man. Cal said. He didn't want you walking in here cold. I looked at the corkboard. How many times did Reed come out here? He doesn't know this place exists. Cal said. Your father never told him. He bought it under a different LLC and paid cash. I poured the coffee and stood in front of the corkboard. The photographs pinned to it were mostly documents. But a few were taken with a phone camera. Reed in a parking lot with another man. Reed coming out of a county assessor's office. Reed at what looked like a construction site, pointing at something on a map. Each photo was dated and annotated. My father had been meticulous about everything except taking care of himself. I drove back to town and called Helen Park. I've been to the building. I told her. I've read both letters. I've started on the hard drive. Her voice shifted. Then you're further along than I hoped you'd be this quickly. Good. I want you to know, your father briefed me on all of this 6 months ago. He gave me a sealed copy of the summary to hold until you contacted me. I'm prepared to move immediately if you want to. What does that mean? It means we file with the county DA's office. She said. We file a civil claim against Reed Calloway personally and against Westridge Partners. We request that the forged appraisals be reviewed and that any county transactions based on them be flagged pending investigation. It's a lot of paperwork. But the documentation your father left is thorough. I've never seen a private citizen put together a case this clean. He was a craftsman. I said. He built things to last. That evening, I drove to my father's house on Ridgecrest and sat at the kitchen table where I'd eaten breakfast every morning until I was 18. The house was unchanged. Tools hung in the garage. A half-finished chair sat in the workshop out back. One leg still clamped in the vise. I opened my laptop and my phone buzzed with a text from Reed. Maya. Just checking in. I know this is a hard time. If there's anything I can do to help with the estate. I have a lot of experience navigating these situations. Your dad and I were family. Let me know. I put the phone face down and went back to the hard drive. The next morning he called. I let it go to voicemail. His message was warm and unhurried. He said he'd heard I was dealing with some of my father's properties and that he'd be glad to help coordinate anything related to the old business. He said my father had always intended for him to stay involved with the legacy of what they'd built. He used the word legacy 3 times in 45 seconds. I called Cal instead. I need to spend more time at the building. I said. Can you be there always? He said. We spent 2 days at the Millward building going through the records. Cal knew more than he let on at first. My father had talked to him the way people talk to someone they trust but don't want to involve sharing enough to be understood. Holding back enough to protect. He knew Reed had threatened my father. He knew the paperwork was in the basement. He knew my father had been sick for longer than I'd realized and had pushed to get the documentation in order before the end. That piece landed hard. I took a walk around the outside of the building by myself and stood looking at the creek that ran along the south edge of the property. Dark and cold with snowmelt. My father had bought this land, kept it secret, and built his case knowing he might not live to see it through. He trusted me to finish it. That thought settled somewhere below my sternum and didn't move. On the second afternoon, I found the subfolder labeled for Maya. Watch first. A video file. I double-clicked it. My father appeared on the screen. He was sitting at the work table downstairs. In this very room. The corkboard visible behind him. He looked thinner than I remembered from the last time I'd seen him. But his eyes were clear and steady. Hey. Sweetheart. He said. If you're watching this, you found everything I put together. I want you to know that I thought about telling you a dozen times. I decided not to, because Reed watches closely, and I didn't want him adjusting his behavior while I was still building the record. Once I was gone, he'd have no reason to think anyone was looking. I hope that made the right kind of sense. It made sense to me. But I know I'm not always easy to follow. He paused, and something crossed his face that I hadn't seen there in years. I'm proud of the person you became. He said. You didn't need me to make this right, but I wanted to make sure you had everything you needed so you didn't have to fight blind. The building is yours. The documentation is yours. Use it the way you see fit. Helen knows what to do. And tell Cal I said thank you. He's a good man. The video was 4 minutes and 12 seconds long. I watched it twice. That evening I drove back toward town and my phone rang. This time it was a number I didn't recognize. I answered. Maya. The voice was smooth and even. It's Reed. I know you've been out at some property your dad left you. I think it would be good if we sat down together before you take any actions. I want to make sure you understand the full picture of where things stood between your dad and me. How did you know I was at the property? I asked. He paused just a fraction of a second too long. Small towns talk. He said. You know how it is. Look. I was your dad's partner for 15 years. I know more about his business than anyone. There are some arrangements that don't look the way they look on paper. And I'd hate for you to make a decision based on incomplete information. What arrangements? I asked. His tone stayed level. That's what I'd like to explain in person. I can come to you wherever you are. I want to be helpful here. Maya. I genuinely do. I'll be in touch. I said. And ended the call. I called Helen immediately and told her about the conversation. He's worried, she said. If he's reaching out directly to you, it means he suspects you've found something. We need to file before he starts moving things. Can you be in my office tomorrow at 8? I was there at 7:50. Helen already had documents spread across her conference table. She walked me through the filings she'd prepared. A criminal complaint with the county DA detailing the forged signatures and their use in fraudulent appraisals, a civil suit naming Reed Holloway and Westridge Partners, a request for a review of 5 specific county land transactions. She also had a contact at the state attorney general's office who handled real estate fraud. This is what your father built, she said. Every filing references documents from the record on the hard drive. The case is as close to self-executing as I've ever seen. I signed where she indicated and she notarized everything on the spot. That afternoon, a woman I didn't know called me from a local real estate news blog. She said she'd received a tip that a woman was attempting to block several community development projects her late father had been involved in. She used phrases like interfering with progress and obstructing deals that were years in the making. She asked if I had a comment. No, come on, I said. But tell whoever gave you the tip that the legal filings are public record and end process. She can read them herself. I called Helen. Reed's already talking to press. I said. He's trying to shape the narrative before the complaint becomes public. She said. It's a standard move. We'll let the filings speak. The next morning, 2 articles appeared online. One called my father's estate a bureaucratic obstacle. The other quoted unnamed sources, saying that a personal dispute was holding up infrastructure investment in the county. Reed's name didn't appear in either article. But the framing was unmistakable. He'd painted himself as a bystander, and me as the obstruction. I drove out to the Millward building. Cal had made coffee. We sat at the work table with the documents spread between us. And I made a list of everyone my father had referenced in his notes who might be willing to speak plainly. A county surveyor who had flagged one of the appraisals internally before being pressured to withdraw the flag, an assessor's aide who had submitted a quiet complaint that went nowhere, a property owner whose land had been acquired under one of the flagged transactions at a price she'd always considered too low. I spent the day making calls. Not asking for favors. Just asking for the truth about what they'd seen and whether they'd be willing to say it on record. 3 out of 5 said yes. That evening Reed called again. His warmth was gone this time. I know you filed something, he said. I didn't confirm or deny it. Maya, I am trying to be reasonable with you. Your father made decisions that don't reflect well on him. I protected him from most of the consequences for years. If you want to open all of that up, I can't stop you. But you're not going to like what comes out. My father's signature was forged on appraisal documents. I said, "That's in the filings. Is there something else you want to add?" The silence lasted long enough that I could hear his breathing. "You're making a mistake," he said. He sounded different now. Not warm. Not smooth. Just tired and a little bit afraid. "I don't think I am," I said, and hung up. I texted Helen immediately. She replied within 2 minutes. "I know." He called me too. The DA's office called this afternoon. They're opening an inquiry. I sat on the floor of the Millward basement with my back against the filing cabinet. The overhead light hummed. The creak outside made a sound like low conversation. I looked at the corkboard my father had built. All the pieces laid out in his particular order. And I felt the weight of how long he'd been carrying this alone. He hadn't told me because he didn't want me carrying it too. He had carried it himself until he couldn't anymore. And then he'd put it somewhere safe and left me the key. The mediation was scheduled for 10 days after the filings. Helen had requested it as a first step, framing it as an opportunity for Reed and Westridge partners to return any improperly obtained payments and issue corrections to the affected appraisals before the criminal inquiry moved forward. She said it was standard practice to offer a path before forcing a trial. I spent the night before in my father's house. I slept in my old room, in the same bed I'd slept in as a teenager, under a quilt my grandmother had made. It felt less strange than I expected. The house didn't feel empty the way I'd been dreading. It felt like it was still holding something. Just quietly. The morning of the mediation I dressed the same way. I dressed for every important meeting. Plainly. Nothing that needed defending. The conference room at the mediation center was neutral and quiet. A round table. 6 chairs. A window overlooking a parking lot. The mediator was a former judge named Arthur Hines, with a reputation for patience and an allergy to theatrics. Helen had chosen him deliberately. Reed arrived with 2 attorneys. He looked older than I remembered from the funeral, which was only 3 weeks ago. He wore a charcoal suit and a careful expression. He didn't try to hug me this time. He nodded. And I nodded back. And we sat on opposite sides of the table. Arthur Hines opened the session calmly. He explained the ground rules. He said his goal was to find out whether any voluntary resolution was possible before the parties went further down the legal path. He said he'd heard from both sides already. He asked Reed's team to go first. Reed's lead attorney, a compact woman named Garland, spoke for 12 minutes. She described my father as a full and willing participant in all transactions. She described Reed as a good-faith business partner who had honored his obligations. She described the dispute as a misunderstanding rooted in grief. She used the word unfortunately 4 times. She said her client was open to a conversation about clarifications. Helen let a beat pass after Garland finished. Then she opened the folder in front of her. Exhibit 1. She said. An appraisal document from March 2020 bearing Thomas Calloway's signature. Alongside it, a handwriting analysis prepared by a certified examiner confirming the signature does not match Thomas Calloway's authenticated samples. That's a forged document used to support a county land transaction. She slid copies across the table. Exhibit 2. Bank records showing a transfer of $62,000 from a Westridge Partners subsidiary to an account controlled by Reed Holloway. Dated 11 days after the March 2020 transaction closed. Another set of copies slid across. Exhibit 3 through 8 follow the same pattern across 5 additional transactions between 2019 and 2022. Each involves a document bearing Thomas Calloway's forged signature. Each is followed by a corresponding payment to Reed Holloway. The total across all 6 transactions is $417,000. The room was very quiet. Exhibit 9. Helen said. An email from Reed Holloway to Westridge Partners dated 14 months before my client's father dissolved the partnership. In it, Mr. Calloway explicitly offers access to Thomas Calloway's professional credentials and signature authority in exchange for a referral arrangement. Thomas Calloway was not copied on this email. He did not write it. He did not agree to it. He found out about it on his own, documented it, and spent 2 years quietly building this record before he died. She closed the folder. "We're not here to negotiate the facts," she said. "The facts are what they are. We're here because we're offering Mr. Calloway an opportunity to return the improperly obtained funds, formally correct the appraisal record with the county, and issue a notarized acknowledgement of what happened. In exchange, we'll recommend to the DA's office that they consider cooperation as a mitigating factor. That's the offer. It's on the table until we leave this room," Garland whispered to Reed. He kept his eyes on the table. His expression had gone very still. And the way faces go when the careful thing has been stripped away, and there's nothing left to arrange. After a long moment, he looked up. "Not at Helen. At me. Your father told you he was clean," he said. "He wasn't clean. He knew what was happening." I looked at him and said nothing. "He knew," Reed repeated. "He went along with the first two. He got cold feet and tried to pull out. I kept him in because I needed his credentials. He should have told you all of that. He told me everything I needed to know," I said. Something shifted behind Reed's eyes. He looked back down at the table. Arthur Hines leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Calloway, I'd recommend you confer with counsel before continuing." Reed waved a hand. "Talk," he said to Garland. She conferred with her associates in a low, urgent cluster. I watched them without watching them. Helen refilled her water glass and made a note on her legal pad. I kept my hands flat on the table and thought about the video my father had recorded in that basement, sitting at the work table with the corkboard behind him, telling me he was proud of me in the same quiet voice he'd used for everything he'd ever meant. Garland turned back to the table. She looked directly at Helen. "What exactly does the agreement require him to sign?" Helen produced 3 copies of a document from the second folder. She walked through it, section by section. Return of $417,000 plus interest. A signed correction request to the county assessor's office on all 6 affected properties. A notarized statement acknowledging sole responsibility for the use of forged signatures. Cooperation with the state AG's investigation into Westridge Partners. No admission of liability regarding Thomas Calloway's conduct. Since that point was contested and irrelevant to the relief being sought, Garland reviewed the document, whispered again, made 2 handwritten changes in the margin, slid it to Helen for response. Helen considered them, approved one, denied the other, initialed the page. The final version went to Reed. He picked up the pen and held it for a moment. I thought about standing up. I sat still instead. He signed. Arthur Hines collected the copies and stamped them. He said a few words about the process, about what happened next, about the 30-day window for the fund return. His voice was even and professional, the voice of someone who had seen this room go many ways. I shook his hand when it was over. I did not shake Reed's hand. He left without looking back. His attorneys on either side of him, moving quickly down the hall. Outside, the air was cool and bright. Helen tucked the documents into her bag and exhaled. "Your father did the hardest part," she said. "He kept his head when he could have been angry. And he built something airtight. All you had to do was show up. That's not nothing." I said. "No," she agreed. "It's not nothing." I drove back out to the Millward building that afternoon. Cal was in the main workshop replacing a hinge on one of the cabinet doors, humming something low and wordless. I told him how it had gone. He set down his screwdriver and looked at the floor for a moment. He would have been glad, he said finally. He used to say he just needed it to hold long enough to get to you. I walked downstairs to the basement one more time. The corkboard was still covered in its careful arrangement of documents and photographs. 3 years of my father's patient work. I stood in front of it for a while. Then I unpinned the documents one by one to return them to their folders, and locked the folders in the filing cabinet. I left the corkboard bare. Upstairs, Cal was finishing the hinge. The cabinet door swung smooth and even on its new hardware. He tested it twice, the way my father would have lost. Closed. Open. Closed again, making sure it would hold. In the weeks that followed, the county assessor's office began the review process on the 6 flagged transactions. Helen forwarded updates every few days. Dry and factual, in the way that good news often is. The property owner who had always felt her land went for too low a price was notified of the investigation. The surveyor who had raised a concern years earlier and been brushed aside called Helen to say he was relieved. 2 of the 3 people I'd called who agreed to speak on record submitted formal statements. I started spending more time at the building. Not just in the basement. I walked the 12 acres properly for the first time, following the creek south to where it bent away through someone else's property. Walking the perimeter of the field behind the building where the light came in flat and golden in the late afternoon. My father had never told me why he chose this specific piece of land. But standing in that field, I thought I understood. It was quiet in the right way. Not empty. Just unhurried. I called my mother one evening from the porch of the building. We hadn't been particularly close over the years. Not since she and my father had separated when I was in high school. But something had shifted in me since the funeral. She answered on the second ring. I've been going through Dad's things. I said. I know. She said. Helen called me. She told me what you found and what you did. He didn't tell me any of it while he was alive. I said. She was quiet for a moment. He didn't want you to have to carry it before you were ready. He was protective that way, even when it came out sideways. Do you think he was right? I asked. She considered it. I think he was as right as he knew how to be. She said. And I think you handled it better than he could have hoped. I looked out at the darkening field. The creek made its steady sound below. The building is mine now. I said. I don't know exactly what to do with it yet. He would have hated it if you left it empty. She said. I know. Cal had a suggestion. Offered so quietly I almost missed it. He mentioned that my father had talked once about wanting the workshop space to be used for teaching. Apprenticeship programs for restoration work. The kind of trade skills that were harder and harder to find. He'd never done anything about it. There was always something else that needed doing first. I started making calls. A community college in the area had been looking for a space, dex.com. A furniture restoration guild in Asheville had a waiting list of people who wanted to learn and no place to send them. A nonprofit that worked with veterans transitioning out of service had been looking for a vocational partnership. I wasn't ready to call any of it certain yet, but I started building the list. One morning, I drove out early enough to catch the sunrise over the field. I sat on the tailgate of my truck with coffee and watched the light come in across the grass. Pale gold and slow. The building sat solid behind me. Brick and old stone, and that out-of-place metal roof that had always looked like an afterthought but was doing exactly its job. Keeping everything underneath dry and intact. My father had kept this place a secret for 8 years. He had worked in it and documented in it and protected it. He had left me the key and trusted me to figure out the rest. I thought about the video one more time. Hey, sweetheart. I'm proud of the person you became. I hadn't heard him say those words out loud in longer than I could easily calculate. I heard them now. Clear and steady. In the voice I remembered from before things had grown quiet between us. The voice from when I was small and the world was the width of his workshop, and everything in it could be repaired. I finished my coffee and went inside to start the day. The creek kept moving outside. The light kept coming in through the high industrial windows in long, clean lines across the floor. Everything my father had built here was still standing. and I intended to make sure it stayed that way. Not as a monument. As a working place. Something used. Maintained. And open. The key was on a hook by the door now. No envelope. No mystery. Just a key in a building that belonged to me. Where the work was only beginning.